Here is something that will completely change how you see medieval combat. The longsword was not a weapon designed to hack people apart. It was, in fact, one of the most sophisticated close-quarter systems ever engineered, more like a thinking man's weapon than a brute's tool. And the fighters who used it, they were essentially the UFC champions of their era, trained, disciplined, and terrifyingly precise. In the next 10 minutes, we're going to tear apart every Hollywood myth you've absorbed about the longsword. We'll look at what it actually was, how it was really used, why its design was a product of pure battlefield genius, and the hidden fighting techniques that were deliberately buried and nearly lost to history. Stick around, because the truth is way more fascinating than anything you've seen on screen. Let's get one thing straight first. People throw the word longsword around like it means any big sword. It doesn't. A true medieval longsword, what German masters called the Longsword, is a very specific weapon. It has a blade typically between 33 and 43 inches long, a crossguard. And here's the key detail: most people miss a grip long enough for two hands, usually around 10 to 11 inches. That dual grip design is the entire point. It gives you a mechanical advantage that a one-handed sword simply cannot match. But here's what most people don't know. The longsword wasn't a heavy lumbering piece of steel. A well-made 15th century longsword weighed between 2.5 and 4 pounds. That's lighter than a modern baseball bat. The weight distribution was deliberately engineered so the point of balance sat just a few inches past the crossguard, making it extraordinarily nimble in the hand. When you actually hold a reproduction longsword made to historical spec, the first thing people say every single time is, "I can't believe how light this feels," because Hollywood handed us a lie. The slow, heavy sword swings you see in films, that's not combat, that's choreography. The longsword emerged as a dominant battlefield weapon roughly between 1300 and 1550 CE, peaking in an era when plate armor was also at its height. And that's not a coincidence. Their development was directly intertwined, and that relationship explains almost everything about the longsword's design. Here's the problem every medieval fighter had to solve. By the 14th century, high-quality plate armor had become so good that a sword edge simply couldn't reliably cut through it. A direct slash against full harness was, frankly, a waste of energy. So what did they do? They adapted. And the solution they came up with is something most people have never heard of. It's called Mordhau, a German word that literally translates to murder stroke. And yes, it's exactly as intense as it sounds. Fighters would grip the blade of their own sword with one or both hands, essentially turning it into a short staff or hammer, and then strike with the crossguard or pommel. The pommel that counterweight at the bottom of the handle became a devastating bludgeon. Think of it as a medieval fighter hacking the system. Your sword just became a war hammer. But the Mordhau is only one part of a much larger system. What nobody tells you is that medieval longsword fighting, particularly the German tradition, codified by a master named Johannes Lichtenauer around 1389, was a complete martial art. It had guards, counterattacks, throws, joint locks, and ground fighting. We know this because the manuals survived. These fighting manuals, called Fechtbücher or fight books, are one of history's greatest hidden treasures. Lichtenauer's system was preserved by his students through the 1400s and 1500s in illustrated manuscripts that show, step by step, exactly how these techniques worked. Scholars and practitioners spent decades in the late 20th century rediscovering and reconstructing this system, a movement now called Historical European Martial Arts, or HEMA. The hidden advantage was that a trained longsword fighter wasn't just a swordsman. He was a grappler, a wrestler, and a weapons tactician all at once. Now let's talk about the blade itself, because the engineering here is borderline obsessive. Every dimension is intentional. Most longsword blades have a diamond or lenticular cross-section rather than a flat profile. This shape gives rigidity and strength without adding weight, essentially the same principle engineers use in modern I-beams. Then there's taper. Longsword blades taper in two directions simultaneously. The profile taper narrows the blade from hilt to point when viewed from above. The distal taper thins the blade from base to tip when viewed edge-on together. These tapers shift mass toward the hilt, which is exactly why the sword feels so lively and quick despite its length. The point itself was often acutely sharp, not just an afterthought, but the primary killing surface against armored opponents. Thrusting into gaps at the armpit, groin, throat, and behind the knee was the intended strategy. You weren't cutting through armor, you were threading past it. And the fuller that groove running down the center of many blades, that people incorrectly call the blood groove, has nothing to do with blood drainage. What nobody tells you is that it's a structural feature, like a crease, down a piece of sheet metal, that dramatically increases rigidity while removing steel and reducing weight. It's clever, practical, and completely misunderstood by basically everyone who's ever mentioned it at a museum. Now here's where the story gets genuinely incredible. We actually know the names of the men who systematized the longsword fighting. This wasn't anonymous folk knowledge. It was a formalized tradition with named masters, schools, and lineages. Johannes Lichtenauer, active in the late 14th century, is the godfather of the German tradition. Almost nothing is known about his personal life, but his teachings, preserved in cryptic verse called the Zettel, were commented on and expanded by a succession of masters over the next 150 years, including Sigmund Renjek, Peter von Danzig, and Hans Talhofer, whose fight books contain some of the most viscerally striking illustrations of medieval combat ever committed to paper. In Italy, a master named Fiore de' Liberi produced his masterwork Flos Duelatorum, The Flower of Battle, around 1410. It is extraordinarily detailed, covering wrestling, dagger, one-handed sword, longsword, polearms, and even mounted combat. Fiore explicitly states that he spent 50 years studying martial arts across Europe before writing it down. This is a man who took the science of fighting with lethal seriousness. But here's what most people do want to know. This entire tradition was essentially forgotten for about 400 years. When firearms became dominant in the 16th and 17th centuries, the longsword fighting system simply became irrelevant, and the knowledge faded. These manuscripts sat in archives across Germany, Austria, and Italy, largely unread and unstudied. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that researchers and martial artists started systematically translating, interpreting, and physically testing these techniques. What they found was a coherent, sophisticated, and brutally effective fighting system hiding in plain sight in European libraries for centuries. So why does any of this matter now, in the 21st century? Because the longsword and the tradition around it tell us something profound about human ingenuity under pressure. Medieval European fighters weren't savages bashing each other with heavy metal sticks. They were problem solvers operating in a lethal environment, and the solutions they developed, the geometry of the blade, the two-handed grip, the integration of grappling and striking, the written transmission of technique, represent a genuine intellectual achievement. The longsword also challenges a massive cultural blind spot. Asian martial arts have been widely celebrated, studied, and practiced globally for decades. But many people, even educated people, had no idea that Europe had an equally rich, equally sophisticated tradition of codified fighting systems. The fact book will prove it beyond any doubt. The longsword isn't just a weapon. It's a window into a lost world of discipline, craftsmanship, and martial science that most of us were never taught existed. From Lichtenauer's cryptic verses to Fiore's meticulous illustrations, the people of medieval Europe left us a record, and we only just now reading it properly. So here's my question for you. Drop it in the comments. Did you know Hema was a thing before this video? And if you could study any historical weapon or fighting style, what would it be? If this blew your mind even a little, hit subscribe. We go this deep on history, weapons, and the hidden mechanics of the ancient world every single week. And if you want to keep going right now, the video on medieval plate armor is right up next, and trust me, it's just as surprising as this one. See you there.